In the early 1600s, across the vast Atlantic, a young man's life took a turn that would echo through American history. His name was Anthony Johnson. Born in the rich lands of Angola, his world was one of community, tradition, and rhythm. But that world would soon be shattered. As European traders expanded their reach along the African coast, thousands were caught in the growing web of forced servitude. Among them was Anthony, taken from his homeland, bound in chains, and placed aboard a ship destined for a world he could not imagine. The year was around 1621 when Anthony arrived in the English colony of Virginia. Life in the New World was harsh and unforgiving. He was not called a slave in the beginning, but rather an indentured servant, a label that promised freedom after years of labor. Yet the reality was brutal. Fields of tobacco stretched endlessly beneath the burning sun, and the work demanded everything from those who toiled there. Still, Anthony endured. He learned the ways of the colony, its language, its customs, and its laws. In time, he earned his freedom, a rare victory in an age when freedom was fleeting for people of African descent. With that freedom came determination. Anthony began to build a life from the ground up, acquiring land, raising a family, and working the soil that had once been his prison. But this story is not just about one man's survival. It is about how the early seeds of race, class, and power began to take root in America. Anthony Johnson's life stands at a crossroads, between freedom and bondage, between opportunity and oppression. His choices would soon lead to one of the most remarkable and controversial moments in early American history. Before his story unfolds further, take a moment to reflect on how one man's journey from captivity to landownership would challenge everything we think we know about the origins of slavery in America. If you find this story as fascinating as we do, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who love uncovering hidden history, and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from the past. Years passed beneath the Virginia sun, years marked by sweat, struggle, and quiet endurance. Anthony Johnson had arrived in this new world as a man bound by contract, his fate controlled by others, his labor traded for a distant promise of freedom. The tobacco field stretched endlessly before him, rows of green leaves that demanded his strength from dawn until dusk. Every sunrise brought the same rhythm, the rustle of the plants, the crack of overseers' voices, and the weight of survival pressing on his back. But within him, there was something that could not be broken, a will to endure. He watched, listened, and learned. The colony was growing, and with it came opportunity, even for those once bound to servitude. Johnson began to understand the language of the land, the laws of men, the cycles of crops, and the fragile balance of power between those who ruled and those who labored beneath them. When his term of servitude ended, sometime in the mid-1600s, he walked into freedom not as the man who had first arrived, but as someone remade by hardship. Freedom was not given easily in the Virginia colony, it was earned, sometimes fought for, and often short-lived. Yet Johnson had achieved what many never could. He was now free, with a name, a small piece of land, and the rare chance to build something of his own. The world around him was changing fast. Tobacco had become the heartbeat of Virginia's economy, and land meant power. Johnson worked tirelessly, planting, harvesting, and trading, slowly transforming his small plot into a thriving farm. He learned to navigate the world of contracts and ownership, to trade with neighbors, and to protect what was his. It was not only skill that kept him alive but also caution. A free man of African descent had to walk carefully in a society where the color of one's skin increasingly defined one's place. In time, Johnson's determination bore fruit. He expanded his land, secured the loyalty of workers, and began to build a reputation as a respected man in his community. He married Mary, who had once been bound by servitude like him, and together they raised a family. Their farm became a symbol of what was possible, a place carved from hardship and perseverance. Yet even in his success, shadows lingered. The colony's laws were beginning to shift. The promise of equality among free men was fading as race began to divide society more sharply. Indentured servitude, once a system that bound both Europeans and Africans alike, was giving way to something far more permanent and cruel. Anthony Johnson's story stood at the edge of this transformation, a moment in history when freedom still had a fragile, uncertain meaning. For Johnson, freedom had been the reward for years of labor and endurance. But for the colony around him, it was becoming a privilege reserved for a shrinking few. His life was proof that determination could defy expectation, yet it also foreshadowed the deep divisions that would soon define America's identity for centuries to come. Anthony Johnson's journey from bondage to freedom was not just a personal triumph, it was a reflection of an age caught between two worlds, one still clinging to its ideals of opportunity, and another already descending into the harsh realities of racial bondage. His footsteps through those Virginia fields echo a question that still lingers in history: how far can freedom truly reach when the world is built to deny it? Freedom had given Anthony Johnson something few men of his background could ever dream of, a chance to shape his own destiny. With steady hands and a vision born from struggle, he began to carve out a life in the soil of Virginia. The land was his now, a vast expanse stretching beyond what he could see, more than 250 acres of fertile earth waiting to be worked. For most, this would have been an ordinary success. But for a man of African descent in the 1600s, it was extraordinary. The colony was still young, raw, and uncertain. Men came to Virginia seeking fortune, but few found it. The wilderness was untamed, the seasons unforgiving. Yet Johnson possessed something rare: patience and persistence forged in hardship. He understood the rhythm of the land, when to plant, when to wait, and when to trust the soil's quiet promise. Slowly, he built a thriving tobacco plantation, a place where rows of green leaves shimmered beneath the sunlight, whispering of both labor and reward. Anthony did not work alone. His wife, Mary, stood beside him through every season. Together they managed their growing household, raised children, and oversaw workers who helped tend the fields. Their farm became a small community of its own, built from endurance, not privilege. Every harvest was a reminder of how far he had come from the days when his life had belonged to someone else. In a society that was beginning to draw lines between race and status, Johnson's rise stood as both a marvel and a quiet defiance. He paid his taxes, appeared in court records as a respected property owner, and traded with his neighbors. To some, he was a man to be admired; to others, his success challenged the boundaries of what the colony believed possible. In a world that was slowly turning freedom into a privilege of skin color, Anthony Johnson's prosperity stood out like a bold statement against the tide. But with success came new challenges. The Virginia colony was evolving, and so were its rules. Land meant influence, but it also meant attention. Johnson navigated the growing tensions with caution, aware that his position was both powerful and precarious. The law recognized his rights, yet the whispers of inequality were spreading fast. The society that once rewarded hard work regardless of origin was beginning to close its doors to men like him. Still, Anthony Johnson refused to retreat. His plantation thrived. His fields filled the air with the sweet, sharp scent of tobacco curing in wooden barns. Ships from across the Atlantic carried his crops to distant markets, linking his small piece of Virginia to a vast and changing world. Each harvest reinforced his place as a man who had not only survived but succeeded, a symbol of what determination could achieve even in the face of barriers that were tightening with each passing year. As night fell over his land, Johnson might have stood at the edge of his fields, watching the stars rise above the dark horizon. The soil beneath his feet held the story of his journey, from captive to servant, from servant to free man, from free man to landowner. His farm was more than a livelihood. It was a declaration that freedom, once claimed, could be cultivated and grown like the tobacco that sustained him. Yet history would remember his success with mixed emotions. For in building his legacy, Anthony Johnson became both a symbol of what was possible and a reflection of a society on the brink of deep moral division. His 250 acres were a triumph of human resilience, and a silent witness to the complicated birth of a nation still learning the meaning of freedom. On the banks of Virginia's eastern shore, where the winds carried the scent of tobacco and salt from the nearby sea, stood the home of Anthony and Mary Johnson. Their farm was not grand by the standards of the English gentry, but it was something far more remarkable, a place born from freedom, built by two people who had once been bound by service. Together, they stood among the first free black families to own land in colonial America, a quiet but powerful mark in a world still uncertain about what liberty truly meant. Mary Johnson had walked a path much like her husband's. Once a servant herself, she had labored through years of hardship before gaining her freedom. When she and Anthony came together, it was not just a marriage, it was a partnership forged in survival and shared hope. Theirs was a life shaped by the land, the rhythm of planting and harvest, the hum of work from sunrise to sunset, and the comfort of family gathered around a small hearth at the end of a long day. Their children grew up knowing both the weight of their parents' past and the promise of their future. Each season brought lessons not only in tending crops but in perseverance and caution. The Johnson family understood that their freedom, though legally recognized, rested on fragile ground. The colony around them was changing, and the laws of men were beginning to draw lines that separated people by color rather than by class. Still, the Johnsons worked the soil as if their future depended on every seed, because in truth, it did. Neighbors spoke of Anthony and Mary with a mixture of respect and curiosity. It was rare enough for any family to prosper in the harsh wilderness of 17th-century Virginia, but rarer still for one of African descent to hold land, livestock, and the promise of generational inheritance. The Johnson plantation became a small symbol of what freedom could achieve when given room to grow. Mary was the heart of that world. She managed the home, oversaw the harvest stores, and ensured that their workers, both black and white, kept the fields in motion. Her name appeared in the colonial records not as a servant, but as Mistress Johnson, a quiet acknowledgement of her standing in a society that rarely granted such dignity to women like her. She and Anthony had built their lives not through privilege, but through relentless labor and unwavering partnership. As their tobacco fields ripened under the sun, the Johnson family found moments of peace. The air filled with the earthy sweetness of drying leaves, the laughter of children drifted from the house, and for a time, the world seemed stable. Yet the signs of change were there, in the laws being written, in the whispers that questioned whether people of their color should possess land at all. The colony that had once rewarded hard work regardless of origin was beginning to redefine freedom itself. Still, Anthony and Mary pressed forward. They paid their dues, maintained their land, and taught their children the values that had carried them through bondage and into freedom, diligence, unity, and courage. Their story was one of quiet strength, not of rebellion, but of endurance against the slow, rising tide of inequality. In the annals of early America, their names would appear only in brief records and faded court documents. Yet behind those lines lies something far greater, the story of a family who turned endurance into legacy, and hardship into home. On that stretch of Virginia soil, beneath the same stars that had watched them through captivity and freedom alike, the Johnsons built a life that proved the human spirit could root itself even in the most uncertain ground and still find a way to grow. As Anthony Johnson's fields flourished and his wealth grew, so too did the demands of the land. The endless rows of tobacco required hands to plant, tend, and harvest. To sustain his expanding plantation, Johnson turned to the same system that had once bound him, indentured servitude. In this, he was not unlike his English neighbors. He employed both black and white laborers, men and women who worked under contracts that promised freedom after a set number of years. It was the way the colony functioned, a world built on labor, where opportunity and hardship walked side by side. The Johnson farm became a small reflection of Virginia's growing society. Every morning, the fields came alive with movement, workers bent over the green tobacco leaves, their backs glistening beneath the rising sun. The rhythm of work was steady and demanding, punctuated by the sound of tools against soil and the calls of those directing the labor. Some of these workers had come from across the Atlantic, Englishmen escaping poverty, Irishmen seeking a second chance, and Africans bound by contracts that blurred the lines between service and bondage. Johnson understood the struggle of those who worked for him. He had been in their place once, a man laboring for another's profit, dreaming of the day his own name would be free. Perhaps it was that memory that drove him to manage his estate with a sense of discipline rather than cruelty. But the times were changing, and so were the expectations. The Virginia colony was shifting toward a harsher order, one that would soon harden the boundaries between who could be free and who could not. For now, the Johnson plantation stood as a rare place where labor crossed racial lines, where contracts rather than bloodlines still determined a person's fate. Some of his servants completed their terms and went on to claim their own pieces of land, as Johnson himself once had. Others found themselves caught in the tightening grip of colonial law, as the distinction between temporary servitude and lifelong bondage began to blur. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, smoke would rise from the curing barns, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Around small fires, workers spoke in different tongues, English, African dialects, fragments of Dutch or Portuguese, all woven together in the strange harmony of the New World. In those moments, the Johnson plantation was not merely a business, it was a crossroads of human stories, each tied to the hope of freedom or the fear of losing it. Yet even as Anthony Johnson prospered, the colony's direction grew clear. The economy of Virginia was transforming, driven by the relentless demand for tobacco and profit. The system that had once offered a path from servitude to freedom was giving way to one that would soon lock generations into bondage with no escape. The plantation that Johnson built, a testament to his endurance and ambition, was also a mirror of the world's growing divisions. Anthony Johnson had risen by mastering the rules of his time, the laws of land, labor, and survival. But the very system that had allowed him to thrive was beginning to harden into something darker. His fields, alive with the sounds of work and harvest, stood at the threshold of change. The same soil that had given him prosperity would soon become the ground upon which America's most enduring struggle, between freedom and control, would take root. For now, though, in that brief moment of history, Johnson's plantation thrived. It was a place where men and women worked, hoped, and endured, a reflection of a world still uncertain of what freedom truly meant, yet driven by the unending desire to claim it. By the year 1655, Anthony Johnson had become a man of standing in the Virginia colony, a landowner, a farmer, and a figure whose success set him apart from many of his time. But his name would soon be tied to a court case that would echo far beyond the borders of his plantation. It was a case that would expose the shifting boundaries of freedom in a society still trying to define itself. Among the people who worked for Johnson was a man named John Casor. Like many others, Casor had entered into service under a contract, a promise that after years of labor, he would be free. Yet, as the years passed, tensions grew. Casor claimed his time of service had ended, that he had fulfilled his duty and deserved his freedom. Johnson disagreed. To him, Casor was bound not for a term, but for life. What had once been a working arrangement now became a bitter dispute that neither man could resolve on his own. In an unusual move for the time, the argument found its way into the colonial courts. Such matters were not new, disagreements between masters and servants were common in Virginia, but the circumstances of this case were unlike any other. A free man of African descent was standing before an English court, arguing that another man of African descent should remain in his permanent service. The courtroom must have carried a heavy silence as the arguments unfolded. Casor insisted that he had earned his freedom, that his years of labor had met the terms of his agreement. Johnson, however, claimed otherwise, saying Casor had no such contract of release. The court examined testimonies, neighbors' accounts, and the customs of the colony. But Virginia was changing. The line between indentured servitude and permanent bondage was becoming increasingly blurred, especially for people of African heritage. What had once been a temporary condition was hardening into something far more permanent. When the verdict was finally delivered, it was unlike anything that had come before. The court ruled in Anthony Johnson's favor, declaring that John Casor would remain his servant for life. It was the first time in the legal history of the English colonies that a man was officially recognized as being bound for life without the promise of eventual freedom. In that single decision, a quiet but monumental shift occurred, the transformation of servitude into what would become lifelong slavery. For Anthony Johnson, the ruling was a victory in the eyes of the law, a confirmation of his property rights and his position within colonial society. Yet history would remember it differently. That courtroom decision marked the beginning of a darker chapter, one that would shape the destiny of millions. What began as a dispute between two men became a precedent, one that allowed the colony to begin codifying human bondage as a legal, racial institution. In the years that followed, laws would multiply, and freedom for people of African descent would become rarer with each passing decade. But in 1655, when the ink dried on that ruling, no one could yet see the full weight of what had been set in motion. The case of Anthony Johnson and John Casor stands today as a haunting reminder of how fragile the idea of freedom can be, how easily it can shift under the force of law, ambition, and fear. What began as one man's fight over labor became a turning point in history, a moment when the promise of liberty began to narrow, and the foundations of a far more enduring system of oppression quietly took hold. When the court of Northampton County delivered its decision in 1655, few could have imagined the weight that moment would carry through the centuries. The ruling in favor of Anthony Johnson did more than settle a dispute between two men, it reshaped the moral and legal landscape of the American colonies. For the first time, the law had declared that one person could be held in service for life without hope of release. And the man who now stood at the center of this turning point was himself a former servant who had once known the weight of bondage. Anthony Johnson, once bound by contract and later freed through perseverance, had now become a symbol of both possibility and paradox. His ownership of John Casor was recorded not as an anomaly, but as a legal fact. It was written into the colony's history, preserved in faded ink, a brief entry that would later be seen as the spark that ignited a slow and irreversible change. What had once been temporary servitude, a system in which men worked to earn their freedom, was beginning to evolve into something permanent and inherited. The ruling established a precedent that would ripple outward across Virginia and beyond. Other landowners watched closely, sensing the shift in how the colony defined property and labor. The law had spoken, and its meaning was clear: certain people could now be held in perpetual service, not for a term or a contract, but for life itself. In that moment, the fragile boundary between freedom and bondage began to crumble. For Johnson, the decision may have seemed like a victory, recognition that his status as a free man granted him the same rights as any other property owner in the colony. But the broader consequences were far greater than one man's gain. In the years that followed, colonial lawmakers began to formalize what had begun in that courtroom. New statutes appeared, each one tightening the definition of servitude and linking it more explicitly to race. The promise that a person could work their way from bondage to liberty slowly vanished. Anthony Johnson's name, once associated with resilience and success, became entwined with a legacy that was both remarkable and tragic. His story reflected the contradictions of an age when freedom was a prize so rare that even those who earned it sometimes feared its fragility. In a society that constantly threatened to strip it away, ownership of land, labor, and livelihood was seen as protection. But that same system of ownership would soon grow into something far larger, consuming generations who would never know the choice to be free. The irony of Johnson's place in history is difficult to ignore. A man who had risen from servitude became the legal pioneer in defining it for others. Yet it was not personal cruelty that marked his actions, it was the structure of a world still learning how to balance power, race, and survival. In his pursuit of stability, he unknowingly helped set the foundation for a system that would define America's deepest divisions for centuries to come. The record of the 1655 case endures as one of the earliest signs of the path the colonies would take, a path that led from contracts and labor agreements to the establishment of slavery as law. It was a quiet beginning, hidden in a small courtroom, witnessed by only a few. But from that day forward, the idea of lifelong servitude became a part of the American story, shaping the destiny of a nation still struggling to understand what freedom truly means. As the years passed, Anthony Johnson's name faded quietly from the records of Virginia. His land was eventually lost, his family scattered, and his story nearly forgotten. Yet the shadow of his life lingered long after he was gone. His journey, from captivity to freedom, from laborer to landowner, and finally to a man whose court case helped define the future of servitude, reflected the contradictions of a world still trying to understand itself. In those early colonial years, the meanings of race, class, and liberty were not yet fixed. The boundaries between who could be free and who could not were written and rewritten in the laws, shaped by fear, greed, and survival. Johnson's life stood at the heart of that transformation. He had risen by mastering the system that once bound him, proving that resilience could carve a place even in an unforgiving world. But in the process, he became part of a story larger than himself, a story that revealed how power can twist freedom into something fragile and fleeting. The Virginia colony that once offered opportunity to servants of all colors slowly turned into a society built on hierarchy and control. What began as a land of contracts and hard work evolved into one of inherited servitude, where the color of one's skin determined one's fate. There is a deep irony in Johnson's legacy. A man who had once fought for his own liberty became a symbol of how freedom could be both granted and denied in the same breath. His case marked a beginning, not of triumph, but of transformation, where the ideals of hard work and reward gave way to systems of inequality that would define centuries of American history. Yet, to understand him is to understand that history is rarely simple. Johnson's life reminds us that people act within the worlds they are given, and those worlds are shaped by the choices of countless others before and after them. Today, his story stands as a mirror to the past, a reflection of a time when the seeds of both opportunity and injustice were sown in the same soil. It asks us to look deeper, to see how easily human ambition and fear can shape the course of history. From the shores of Angola to the fields of Virginia, Anthony Johnson's journey tells us not just where America began, but how it learned to define the meaning of freedom itself. If you found this story thought-provoking, take a moment to like this video, share it with others who seek to uncover forgotten chapters of history, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that reveal the complex, untold past that shaped our world.